CJ Pearson is the co-chair of the GOP Youth Advisory Council. At 22 years old, he made Time Magazine's top 100 creators, and his parties in Washington D.C. have become around the inauguration became infamous when New York Magazine entitled it "The Cruel Kids Club." I know they meant that as an insult, but it was iconic. CJ, thank you for being here.
Ryan, thanks so much for having me. Good to see you.
Okay, CJ. President Trump received a record breaking support among young voters in 2024, especially among young men. What do you contribute that to?
I think authenticity. I think the president, was very intentional about meeting young voters where they were, but also too, he didn't try to change himself or become a chameleon based on who he was talking to. Every time Kamala Harris sat down with a podcaster or a late night television show, you didn't know if she was Jamaican, Mexican, or whatever else. But when when President Trump went on a podcast, he talked about cocaine. He talked about his celebrity friends from growing up in the city of New York and being a real estate titan. People ask me all the time, how did President Trump win the bro vote? He won the bro vote by being a bro, like unapologetic
Mhm.
himself. And I think the results speak for that.
Yeah, David Shore, who's a progressive data scientist. I'm not sure if you read his stuff, but his finding was that young white men under the age of 22 were the most Republican group in the country for like I think the first time ever. How did you or how did the GOP in a larger sense help effectively mobilize young people for that election?
I think going into the election, we knew that we were going to have to turn out low propensity voters if we were really going to get the president across the finish line, right? And I think the podcast strategy, which Alex Bruschwitz deserves a lot of credit for, was a critical piece of the puzzle in that, right? Because like these low propensity voters are not watching Fox News, they're not watching CNN, but they are watching Theo Vaughn, they are watching Andrew Schultz, and they are watching Bustin' with the Boys on Barstool. And so the president going on these platforms and kind of taking his message in a place where they oftentimes wouldn't expect to hear them or wouldn't, want to hear them there, but kind of making them was incredibly effective in that sense. But also, too, I think that the president's just use and embrace of social media, like TikTok, was a big part of it. I know TikTok gets it's a little bit controversial in our circles every now and again, but the president, had a lot of tremendous success on there. And I remember, like in the early days of the campaign, this was still during the primary, if you were to, I guess, call it that. We were talking at the RNC. They're like, like we need to be on TikTok, and there was still this concern about, getting on, a platform, with ties to China and all of these things. But my argument was simple back then, and I think it remains true today, is that we can either cede the entire platform to the left, where an entire generation of young Americans will be inundated with leftist propaganda, or we can go and play ball. And what we see is when we go and play ball, we win the ball game.
Right. I knew I was old when I didn't go on TikTok. I just if I was if I would have told my family and friends when I was 21, "Hey guys, we're going to do synchronized dances together for strangers to watch," they would have put me in an institution, but that's not like I don't get there's a generational divide between there. So, at the top of the show, I was reading of two conflicting polling data, right? The first was a Pew Research finding that young men are overwhelmingly more likely to identify as Republicans, and then a series of recent polls that found President Trump's support among young people has declined substantially, even in polls that really nailed the 2024 election. And I'm going to guess which one you probably think is more accurate. But do you see that there is some kind of declining support among people who maybe voted for Trump, but aren't super partisan, or these low propensity voters have kind of shied away from him and hold negative feelings, or maybe even among some non diehard MAGA group? Is there a declining support in any way that you can see?
Not that I can see, and honestly, I got to tell you, the only poll that I really care about is the one that happens on election day. But looking at, of course, the president's support among young men, I think it's clear as to why they came over to his side, right? The left has spent the last decade, if not more, demonizing young men for simply being young men, demonizing us for seeking to be providers, protectors, and all of those things. And I think that young men were sick and tired of it, which is why they came over to President Trump's side. I'm familiar with the recent poll that came out, and honestly, I'm in the camp camp that actually it's not because young men are going back to the left, or they're drifting leftward. It's honestly probably because they're a little bit more right wing than we would maybe like to believe here. And so I think there's definitely an eagerness for President Trump to continue to deliver on his America First agenda, which I think he's working aggressively to do every single day. And I think that young voters are smart enough to realize that a lot of the nonsense that the left has been spewing about him and the corporate media has been spewing about him is inaccurate. And I think when it actually comes down to it, when the midterms come to head, I think that they will follow their behaviors that we saw in the 2024 election, which is a resounding support for President Trump's agenda.
Well, I think also we live in a very fickle society where people kind of demand things changed in the blink of an eye. So when things don't, change in minutes, people are like, well, it failed then. How do you, as a content creator and somebody who spends, who knows a lot of content creators, especially, how do you combat like the Harry Simpsons of the world and left wing content creators who like sit there and talk about Trump's mass deportation or something like that and say like it's all negative? How do you sit there and counter that argument?
Well, I think it's simple. This is exactly what voters voted for, right? They portray these facts that this is just some random thing that just started happening. President Trump ran on this. He was unequivocal that this is exactly what he would do if he was elected, and the American people voted for him. He won the popular vote, the electoral college vote, with full knowledge of that. And so I think, looking at the Harry Sissons of the world and other folks like him, they can parrot all these DNC talking points all they would like, but at the end of the day, the president's approval rating when it comes to his handling of immigration is pretty damn high. And it's in large part because of the fact voters want strong borders. They want secure borders. And I think it's exactly why they've latched into this Epstein issue, because they realize that when the president is talking about immigration, he's winning. When the president's talking about actual fairness in trade, he's winning. And they have been, trying to figure out what message will actually stick. And now they've latched onto this Epstein nonsense, which is interesting to me because it's so odd to me that they didn't care about protecting the innocence of children until it was a politically expedient issue for them to do so. And they still actually don't care about it because they're okay with transing children and the mutilation of their genitals. So honestly, it's interesting to me that all of a sudden they're so passionate about protecting America's children when they weren't. When it actually could have mattered, or when Bill Clinton was on that plane and went to that island, I think 20 plus times.
Yeah. Well, the funny thing is that I mean, so even though CJ is only 22, he's been doing this. I thought you were way older because I feel like I've seen you do this forever.
Oh
You've
my
done
god,
it
I
like
gotta get a better skincare routine then. What's going
no,
on?
no, 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 not age wise, just because I feel like I met you a million years ago, but it was you started when you were 12, so it's been a really long time. But when you're even a little older, like I am, I remember in like 05, 04, Afghanistan being like the titular issue, and Democrats saying just give us the house and we'll get out of Afghanistan. They got the house in Afghanistan. The withdrawal did not happen, in any time fashion. And I kind of think the Epstein thing is the same thing as just give us and we'll release the documents. And I don't think those documents are ever coming to light in any, but no matter who's in charge, but that's just my opinion. What would you think was the thing when it comes to, I think there's a surprising thing going on with young men in the sense that, the left's message to them, from what I see from like young progressive influencers, is it's your own fault that you feel like you can't make it. Um, and like that kid who smokes the anxiety pen or whatever the case may be, that person who had a nervous breakdown on on Instagram or whatever. Yeah. Um, and but when I see some like right wing or conservative commentators on who are young men, they are more right wing than what you would have seen on, like, let's say just Fox News like 20 years ago or 10 years ago. What was acceptable conversation about policy? Um, a lot of people on, like, I guess the mainstream media would say this is a horrible thing that they've been converted for this, but um, haven't they just been pushed into this by quote unquote acceptable opinion from mainstream outlets over the years? You know what I'm saying?
Yeah, yeah, I would think so. And I also think too, it's important to, read this against the backdrop of the fact that we're the COVID generation. I graduated high school in 2020. I had my high school graduation robbed away from me. I had my high school prom robbed away from me, all of these things. And we saw the effects of these draconian progressive policies in real time in a very visceral way. And I think that this is still front of mind for a lot of young people in my generation. And so I think that when you ask, why are they swinging so far to the right? I think it is a direct result of the fact that we swung so far to the left and the pendulum is just going in the other direction right now. For a long time, leftist progressives, they could go on TV and, say death to the white man. They could, demand reparations. They could, justify furries and, litter boxes in public schools. And this was just common discourse. Like, and they weren't, like CNN was putting these people on TV and treating them as if like this was a legitimate point of view. And so,
But
I don't.
don't you dare make a beeper joke on
Right,
CNN.
right. I
That's
don't ever
my
do that.
line.
But it's like one of those things too. It's like I'm not surprised to see the pendulum swing in the way in which it has, because for a long time, I think, young people, especially young men, they were told we're not allowed to think these thoughts. We're not allowed to say these things. And so now I think in a kind of a post cancel culture environment where everyone's kind of emboldened and people can say things they, usually probably weren't allowed to say. And even things too, it's like, having, you said it, like having been doing this since I was 12, like seeing the what's acceptable discourse kind of change, things that would have gotten you absolutely like banned from Fox News, many years ago, now people are just, up and at it. So I think it's in large part because of the fact the left for a long time treated young conservatives, especially young men, as like an underclass. And we're just kind of over it. And we're like, no, like, fuck these people.
What well there goes the explicit note on, on the disclaimer on the podcast episode. What but it's never me cursing. It's always my guest, by the way.
You have such a great network of folks.
I know. Well, I mean, the okay. So, just in two questions that linger in my mind. So, let's say that you know Trump's numbers when young people drop because they drop. Every incumbent president's numbers drop because they have to actually do things, and people are upset with the speed in which things get done and whatnot. But does this support for Trump that he experiences, record level support, does it transfer over to the Republican Party and large?
I think that remains to be seen. I think, JD as like kind of the heir apparent is really good at doing a lot of what the president did during the campaign, right? Sitting down with, the Theo Vaughns of the world, the Joe Rogans of the world, and making a strong case for, I think, the future of the movement. Does it translate to folks down ballot? I don't know. It's one of those things where I think the president's going to have to go out and actually do these rallies. And thankfully, he's a high energy guy, and I think he wants to do it. He wants to go to Georgia. He wants to go to North Carolina. He wants to go to a lot of these target seats and districts. So I think they'll have, that going for them. But I think Republicans are going to have to really frame to these low propensity voters. And this is a problem that we've seen, right? It's like when Trump is not on the ballot, people just simply stay home. And so I think that what we have to really do is frame the urgency of this, and why it's going to be so important for us to expand our majority in the Senate, hold on to the House as much as we can, because we're seeing it right now. Every single, it's so crazy. It's like Mike Johnson's the most slept on person in Washington. Every single time a big bill comes up, everyone's like, how is he going to do it? How is he going to do it? And I'm sure that Mike Johnson is stressed out trying to figure out how is he going to do it. So let's give him a majority that he can actually work with, where you don't have, a few errant members, who can hold the entire caucus hostage, right? And so I think we've got to frame that urgency. How do you do that for young voters who don't really know about why these majorities are so important, or why it's important for us to have a 10-seat majority rather than a 4-seat? I don't know. There are smarter people who can answer that question. It's definitely going to be, I think that's the elephant in the room. How do you make this as urgent as the 2024 election was? And that's going to be the challenge.
Yeah, I think that trying to get low propensity voters out in the midterms is, I mean, that's really the whole kit and caboodle. Because what people often sit there and ask about is like, how did seniors become so left wing? And I said, it's not that they became so left wing; it's that the people that you think of as seniors are probably no longer with us, and the people who are seniors were, they were. It was very old reference I'm going to say to you, which you probably might not even know, but if you watch like All in the Family, Archie Bunker in real life has passed away, and his like liberal hippie children are senior citizens now. So like the conservative ones that you think of from like 30 years ago are probably no longer with us, or if they are, they're in a nursing home. And the you know former hip children of the former hippie generation is senior citizens now. So that's, I think, the big confrontation. And if you're relying on 18 to 22 year olds, I think that's the biggest thing. If you're a young person today and you want to be active and not make this your whole career, but voice your opinion and support them, what should you be doing as someone who's done this for so long?
Yeah, I think get involved in a campaign. That's how I got my start when I was 12 years old. I showed up to the campaign office of now Congressman Rick Allen, and I just started knocking on doors and making phone calls. And I learned a lot from that campaign. And I think it's kind of helped me as a commentator, right? Because I think there are a lot of influencers in this space who don't necessarily understand politics, right? But they understand ideology. They understand that they love MAGA and they love America First policies. But in terms of like the actual mechanics of making these things happen, it may not be like their strong suit. And it goes back to the point that you were making earlier. It's like a lot of people get dissatisfied with things not moving at the speed of light. But I think anyone who kind of has, worked in these spaces and kind of understands the way Washington works, it's nothing is really meant to move at the speed of light in this town, unfortunately, unless it's a bad idea. And so when it comes to, getting involved in all of those things, I would say start on a campaign. It's going to change your life. You're going to meet so many cool people. There's nothing like that grind. But also, too, it's never been easier to kind of be an influencer. It's one of those things where it's like I saw a recent study where it was like the number one job for like Gen Alpha is to be an influencer. And I think which is interesting for a lot of reasons. But I think, go on TikTok, start talking about these issues, and dig deep and kind of just be a truth teller. The only way that we're going to beat back the bad ideas of the Harry Sissons and the Parkers and the Reeds and all those people is if we put our ideas out there and we flood the zone with our better ideas and our better policies. And so that's what I would recommend. And what I would also say too is like have the courage to stand up for yourself in your college classrooms. I get messages all the time from college kids who are like, my liberal professor is so crazy. I just like always want to challenge her, but I feel bad. Like I think she's going to come for me or whatever. Courage is contagious. When I was at the University of Alabama, you would never think that there would be a liberal professor there, but there were. And I would raise my hand and I would push back if she said something that was, anti-Trump or just flagrantly incorrect. And after class, some people would walk up to me and say, CJ, like I was thinking that, but I just didn't have the courage to say it, but maybe they'll say it next time. And so I think be bold, stand on business, and use the tools that you have to platform your voice and amplify the passions that you care about.
Yeah, that's happened to me in college all the time. I was the only one. That's probably why I didn't finish college. So,
Me either.
and yeah, that's probably not the best advice if you want to finish college. I also want to say what CJ said. There's not many influencers who know the mechanics of campaigns. There are almost no influencers that know the mechanics of campaigns. Not just a few. I could probably name the ones that do on one hand, and there's not many. Do you ever notice like the Harry Simpsons and all those people all have the same haircut? By the way, I'm just thought of that while you were talking about. There's like one haircut.
It's probably poll tested. I'm sure the Center for American Progress did a nice poll on, what's the douchiest haircut that we can do that will lure in young women who love men with testosterone deficiency and still, help us somehow appeal to the bro vote. Yes.
Well, okay, CJ, where can people go to follow all your stuff and keep in touch with you and read what you're doing?
Yeah, definitely. Well, thank you so much for having me, Ryan. It's always a fun time. They can keep up with me on all the platforms. My username is the CJ Pearson, and I'll see them there.
All right, thank you for being on this podcast.
Thanks for having me.